Why the Bible is silent about the Egyptian pyramids. Ancient Egypt was an incredible civilization that prospered for thousands of years along the vast Nile River. Home to some of the world's earliest cultures, the finest megalithic architecture, and a remarkable ancient writing system, these ancient peoples had an effect on every culture they came in contact with. Yet the ancient nation is more famous for its megalithic construction practices that allowed them to build structures such as the Great Pyramids, which lie in what is modern-day Giza. Join us in this video as we explore why one of the world's most ancient and sacred collections of texts is silent regarding the remarkable wonders of Egypt. Historical significance of the Bible. The Bible has remained both an influential and controversial text, depending on who you ask. The oldest version, written in ancient Hebrew and passed on for thousands of years, sheds light on what life was like during the Bronze Era for the pre-Israelites who lived in lands east and south of the Mediterranean Sea. Great prevalence is placed upon specific patriarchal figures such as Enoch, Abraham, and Moses, all of whom played the significant roles in the history of the Jewish people. As well as figures, certain places are mentioned, many of which archaeologists and historians of the modern era have been able to identify. Canaan is the most mentioned era in the Old Testament. The Canaanites, a name that refers to various ethnic groups that inhabited the southern Levant, are mentioned over 150 times in the Bible. Eventually, the area would be synonymous with the Promised Land, where the nomadic Hebrew people would venture and settle down permanently. But there are several other places mentioned on a consistent basis in the ancient text, and the second most prevalent is none other than Egypt, the land of the Pharaohs. Egypt is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible almost 700 times and referred to another 25 times in the New Testament, making it the most frequently mentioned place outside of Canaan in the Bible. Yet, nowhere in the entirety of the Old Testament does the book mention the Pyramids of Giza or even the Sphinx. This is a question that has puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries. If you like what we do here, support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. The Great Pyramids of Giza. For thousands of years, travelers and scholars of the Old World have ventured far from the homes to Egypt and have experienced firsthand what made this culture so revered. Of all the structures that dot the landscape surrounding the Nile Valley, none have caught the attention of ancient and recent writers quite like the Great Pyramids. The Greek historian Herodotus was the first scholar to write documents in this ancient area. Often referring to as the father of history, he provided one of the earliest and most cited descriptions of the pyramids in his work, Histories. Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and documented various aspects of Egypt's civilization, including the construction and significance of the pyramids. However, some details in his accounts, especially regarding the methods of pyramid construction, have been subject to skepticism and debate among historians and archaeologists. The next most famous documentation, which mentions the pyramids, comes from Manetho, an Egyptian historian and prince who wrote the Egyptica in the 3rd century BC. The work included various aspects of Egyptian history and chronology, provided vital information about the dynastic lineage of pharaohs, and offered some context about the pyramid builders. Later historians, including those from Greco-Roman period, extensively use Manetho's writings. Many Greek and later Roman scholars would have stood at the feet of this great monument and stared with the astonishment at its complexity. After all, we know now that it's made up of over 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing, on average, 2 tons each. In the description of this video, you'll find a link to our episode related to the secrets of the Sphinx of Giza. Yet the question remains, if the Greeks, later dynastic Egyptians, and Romans all wrote of the pyramids, Why were they initially left out of the Hebrew Bible, even through various prophets, such as Moses, lived in that region? Moses and his ventures through Egypt. According to the biblical tradition, Moses lived sometime between 1300 and 1200 BCE, give or take a couple of centuries. In biblical chronology, this is 200 to 400 years or so after Joseph, and therefore at least 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids of Giza were built. Assuming the standard of age applies to the physical product, the pyramids are older. They were constructed between 4,400 and 4,600 years ago, and the earliest parts of the Bible, otherwise known as the Tanakh, were written down perhaps 3,000 or so years ago, so there's no doubt the pyramids existed when the Hebrew people were in Egypt. But as we previously mentioned, the Bible references Egypt, claiming they had wealth, a strong army, and powerful kings. In difficult times, Abraham and many of his descendants sojourned to Egypt for food and shelter. This helps to confirm that it was the region's most influential and prosperous nation. With the information provided in the Bible, we could assume that the Hebrew people living in the region traveled from place to place. Maybe they even heard the legends of the pyramids partially buried in the sands around Giza. But then, why don't we have a single mention of the pyramids in the Bible? Reasons why they weren't mentioned. This question has caught the attention of various Jewish and biblical scholars in previous centuries. Each researcher has given a unique answer to the question, which is generally more straightforward than you'd imagine. One popular idea is that the construction of the pyramids is not explicitly mentioned in the Bible simply because it had nothing to do with the Jewish people. The dynastic Egyptians built the pyramids, an ethnic group that had been living in the region for thousands of years. Thus, they were not of the same stock as the nomadic wandering Hebrew people who arrived in the region much later. So scholars have summarized that the pyramids were excluded from the Bible as their purpose did not impinge on any biblical doctrine. Another primary reason put forth by the same researcher claims that the Jewish people of the biblical era never actually visited the Great Pyramids in Giza, and many likely didn't even know they existed. In this scenario, we may surmise that they aren't mentioned for the same reason that the Old Testament doesn't mention the Grand Canyon or the Great Wall of China. None of the actions of the Old Testament take place or at near the Giza Plateau. The closest that the Hebrews ever came to the pyramids in the biblical narrative were the cities of Pi-Ramses and Pithom, roughly 80 miles north of the Great Pyramid. Both of these reasons have given scholars and researchers enough ample evidence to suggest there's no reason the early Hebraic people would have had any information about the pyramids in the Bible. However, there is a more controversial theory that claims the ancient Hebrew peoples were never in Egypt in significant numbers, nor were they a slave race put to work by the dynastic peoples. The evidence for this claim comes from the little to no zero archaeological evidence for the Exodus story. This has led some scholars to suggest that the biblical book is nothing more than a fundamental myth and, as such, contains story elements that drive the narrative. But in no way should it be considered an accurate historical portrayal of events or conditions in Egypt at the time the pyramids were constructed. According to the original mythologists, would have had no reason to conjure anything like the pyramids in their stories. Instead, they intended to create a coherent story of persecution and redemption in order to create a political and cultural entity unified around a certain core principle. With that being said, there is one more highly speculative theory that the alternative researcher Eric von Daniken has been at the center of. He looks to an account by an ancient Abraham historian named Al-Makrizi, who writes that the Great Pyramid was known to have been built by a king who lived before the Great Flood, called Surid. King Surid was more commonly known in Hebrew as Enoch. Von Daniken says he believes that in preparation for the Great Flood, Enoch constructed the pyramids to protect biblical texts for future generations to discover. Yet even though the Book of Enoch is not typically considered apocryphal, meaning that it's intentionally left out of modern Bibles, it doesn't outright claim that Enoch played a role in the construction of the pyramids. What do you think about the conclusions put forth by researchers? Do you have another theory as to why there's no mention of the megalithic works of architecture? Let us know all your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.